Today I'm talking with Grahame Grieve, the project leader of the global HL7 fire standardization effort. He's here all the way from Melbourne, Australia for an HL7 meeting this week in Atlanta. Grahame, thank you very much for taking the time to be with me. I know this is a busy week for you. Perhaps we could begin by you discussing your background.
So I qualified as a biochemist, worked in a clinical lab, did a bit of research, and then I ended up as a lab systems vendor, tech lead, and got more involved in interoperability and HL7, and eventually created my own consulting company to do HL7 consulting.
So beginning in 2011, you invented the whole idea of fire. Can you tell us how that happened?
Well, we were getting to a point where the HL7 was a crossroads. We had a lot of existing standards that no longer reflected what people wanted to do, and there was a lot of unhappiness in the user community. And we said, well, what if we did something like this? And that grew into fire, and it was a bit of a surprise to me as much as to everyone else that it was so popular, but it's been certainly keeping me busy ever since.
By all accounts, the growth of fire adoption is nothing short of phenomenal. Could you give us an idea of how it's being adopted, not just here in the US, but around the world?
Well, we expected that initially, while it's still a trial beta standard, which it still is, that we would have a little bit of adoption, particularly in companies doing health data exchange in the social web area. But it's just been crazy. We have government programs, large government programs, some ONC programs, other national governments around the world. We have big vendors creating consortiums like Argonaut and HSPC. Lots of little companies and institutions creating solutions based on fire. You know, we have thousands of implementations happening at the moment.
So I believe the ballot on fire as a second version of a draft standard for trial use was just conducted, or is being conducted. Where are we in the whole evolution of fire to a full HL7 standard?
So we balloted the standard in May, and then we just published last week, in September, the formal second version. It's an ongoing process where we started with a very initial draft, and then I think of this as the first fully usable version, and we're calling it a trial version so that we can still introduce new content and refine the core standard. But increasingly, we're going to treat the core as a normative standard, and I think the next version will represent a stable version for implementers to base the core clinical stuff on. But you know, it's an ongoing process, and we'll be very driven by the feedback we get from the community about that, which is why we're not saying right now how it will unfold. We don't want to dictate to the community.
Well, I've heard numbers in terms of the ultimate number of fire resources, anywhere from 100 to 200. I suppose nobody actually knows at this point.
Well, we have 96 as of today, and we sort of said 200 was a nice number. We didn't want to have thousands or hundreds of thousands, which were possible choices. We haven't got a fixed number that we're going to get to.
So that leads directly to a topic you and I have discussed when we were together in the past. To me, obviously the use of web services and JSON objects, these technologies that are so common in other domains is very interesting, and I think very important to the success of fire. But perhaps even more interesting is your mission of not allowing fire to become an overly complex standard, like many of the predecessor standards in HL7. How is that going? That must be a very tough thing to do.
It's an interesting thing to try and do. We have constant pressures to try and simplify it and constant pressures to try and complicate it. And we've got to strike a balance between handling the things people need to do and not letting it get so complicated no one can do what they need to do. Most of the success in that area comes from the processes that we laid down at the start around solid engagement with the implementation community and being responsive to them. And we grade the successive parts of the standard not by publication but by adoption. And that's a very important metric that drives a wider consideration of the perspective than just how do we produce a standard.
So the people who ultimately have to use this standard and implement it have a big voice in what the standard looks like. And it isn't just designed by, I'll use the term standards geeks. I hope that isn't a pejorative term.
That's a very common term. That's exactly what we're trying to achieve, so that you can define the standard as a committee, but until it's been adopted and proven in practice, it's always going to be draft.
So as you look out toward the future, after the final version of FIRE is published, how do you see it continuing to evolve and adapt to an ever-changing world?
Any community goes through phases of storming, norming, conforming, and clearly the core of the specification is moving into the norming phase now, and will become more and more stable, and growth will happen at the margins. And then there's at some point where you'll say that the standard has now got as big as it can be. It's no longer efficient to keep growing and to keep pushing it along, and it's time to start considering a new choice. I kind of thought, just looking at the past record of standards, that a development lifespan, maybe 15 years or so, and we're sort of 5 or 15 now. And then at that point, you start to say maybe it's no longer worth keeping going. You know, that's 10 years out. We'll see how we go. But at some point you go, it's just not worth keeping going.
So one final question. So what would you say to the students taking this course about FIRE and about how they might both think about it, use it, and look for opportunities that FIRE creates?
FIRE is really different to all the other approaches we've had because it allows you to modularize your solutions and to create capabilities that can be used in all sorts of different ways. And so in the long term, it's going to represent decomposing large systems into more interoperable small systems. And there's going to be a lot of opportunity for change in the healthcare system, not IT, but in healthcare itself, driven by the capabilities of the decomposition and the flexibility that it offers. You know, we didn't write FIRE because we wanted to have a nice standard. We wrote FIRE because we wanted implementations to drive a better healthcare system. And that's going to be our main focus going forwards is, you know, we'll round out the standard and finalise the standard, but our main focus is going to be how do we drive that to get a healthcare system that's more nimble, more patient-focused, more responsive to change, because the existing system's pretty rigid.
Well, I not only want to thank you, I want to tell you how much I admire you and what you're doing. I'm a lot older than you are. I'm not even sure you were born when I got involved in health IT, and I never thought I'd actually live to see what we're seeing, which I agree with you completely, is an absolutely workable, implementable, deployable solution to interoperability and to actually making health data a tool for improving healthcare. So congratulations, and thank you so much.
Thanks.